Jasmine petals fell on my shoulder. Sweat gathered on my palms, and a white envelope lay quietly on the church steps. That's how I ended my daughter's wedding day. Not with a hug, not with a smile, but with silent sunlight and the taste of dust in my throat. It sounds unbelievable, I know. But everything began with one phone call and 4 words that hollowed me out. Dad, we're full. My name is Robert Ellison, 67 years old. A carpenter. A restorer of old homes. A widower who's learned to measure time not by years, but by the sound of his tools, the hum of a saw, the rhythm of a hammer, the sigh of wood bending just right. I've built houses for 4 decades across Savannah, Georgia, that old southern city where humidity clings like memory and the river carries every secret down to the sea. I've restored mansions, churches, porches, built foundations strong enough to outlive hurricanes. But I never imagined that when I grew old, I'd be the one left standing outside the door. My daughter Madeline married into money, the Monroe family. They own real estate, social reputation, and an arrogance polished brighter than their marble floors. To them, I was a story they didn't want retold, a man who worked with his hands. Hands that smelled of varnish, not champagne. Hands that could fix a cracked beam, but not apparently a fractured heart. Savannah was golden that morning, the kind of sunlight that turns even cracked sidewalks into gold. The air carried the scent of jasmine salt and exhaust from Bull Street. It was the sort of day that promised beginnings, but for me, it felt like an ending dressed in white. St. Paul's Church gleamed at the top of the hill, freshly painted, its dome rising like a crown above the city. Black limousines lined the curb. Groomsmen in gray suits moved in perfect order, their laughter blending with the soft music drifting from inside. Reporters stood near the gate. It was, after all, the event of the season. The union of legacy and power, one headline called it. I arrived in my 2008 Ford pickup, the kind of truck that doesn't hide its age. The engine rattled softly when I parked, like it was embarrassed to be there. On the passenger seat lay a white envelope, the edges worn from my thumb. Inside was a check and a short note written in my uneven hand for you to start a home of your own and to remember everything solid begins with a strong foundation. It wasn't just money. It was the last piece of my pride. I'd planned to give it to Maddie after the ceremony, when the crowd was gone, when it was just the 2 of us. I imagined her hugging me, saying, "Thank you, Dad." That would have been enough. But that plan never made it past the front steps. A young man in a suit stepped forward as soon as I reached the stairs. He looked about 25, nervous in his own skin. He held a clipboard like a shield. "Sorry, sir," he said quickly, eyes scanning the paper. "The ceremony's at capacity. Only listed guests are allowed inside." I reached into my pocket and handed him the invitation cream cardstock embossed with gold initials M&M. He glanced at it and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. The list was updated this morning. Your name's not on it anymore." For a moment, the world went still. Even the traffic on Bull Street seemed to hush. A warm gust of wind passed and a few jasmine petals landed softly on my jacket. I forced my voice to stay even. "My daughter is the bride." He looked down, didn't say a word. Then I heard it, the creak of the church door opening behind him. Madeline, my little girl, stood framed in the doorway, her veil glowing in the sunlight. The white dress shimmered like a reflection on water. And for a heartbeat, I saw her as she was years ago, a child sitting on the workshop floor, laughing as sawdust clung to her hair. But this time she didn't laugh. Her eyes met mine. They trembled once, then went cold, smooth as glass. "Dad," she said softly. "I'm sorry. The ceremony's already full. No anger, No hesitation. Just a polite sentence, the kind you use to send someone away. Behind her stood Daniel Monroe Jr., the groom. Tailored suit, perfect smile. A man born to believe every door would open for him. He adjusted his cufflinks, looked me over, and smirked, not cruelly, just with the calm satisfaction of someone who knows he's already won. I could have shouted. I could have asked her, "Is this what love taught you?" But I didn't. Because some lessons are louder in silence. I took a breath and said quietly, "I wish you both a strong foundation, though I doubt it will hold for long." Her eyes lowered. He smiled tighter. And the door closed between us. The church bells began to ring, each chime slicing through the air, sharp, metallic final. I stood there watching people rush past me in their polished shoes and perfume. Their laughter echoed against the stone walls. Inside, a new family was being built. Outside, another was ending. I didn't move until the bells faded. When I turned, the sunlight was blinding Savannah, glowing gold, as if mocking the chill crawling under my skin. The envelope in my hand was wet with sweat. The ink on Maddie and Daniel had blurred into a single dark stain. I set it down on the church steps, right where the jasmine petals had fallen. The wind shifted, and for a second I thought I heard Elaine's voice, my late wife, soft, steady, saying, "Let it go, Robert. Let it go." But the only sound left was the distant hum of traffic and the quiet creak of my knees as I walked away. The truck engine coughed to life. I sat there, hands on the wheel, watching the reflection of St. Paul's in the rearview mirror. The dome shimmered like a crown, beautiful, unreachable, built by hands like mine, but never meant for me. As I pulled onto the road, the radio flickered on a soft jazz tune filling the cabin. I thought of all the times Maddie had sung along as a little girl off-key, laughing, her head resting on the passenger seat, the same seat where the envelope had just been. I wanted to feel anger, but anger is hot, and everything in me felt cold. I drove past the park where I used to push her on the swings, past the diner where Elaine and I had breakfast every Sunday, past everything that used to mean something. The sunlight glared off the windshield, but the inside of the truck stayed dim. When I stopped at a red light, I caught my reflection in the mirror. A man with gray hair, lines like fault cracks across his face, and hands that had spent too long holding on to things already gone. I parked by the riverfront, rolled down the window, and let the air in. The water smelled of salt and thyme. A tugboat horn echoed in the distance, low, steady like a heartbeat. I lit a cigarette, watched the smoke curl into the air. Then I said softly to no one, "Some silences don't need church bells. They ring inside you, and they never stop." I sat there until the sun dipped low, and the light turned from gold to copper to gray. When the first drops of rain hit the windshield, I started the engine again. That sound, the old engine's growl mixed with thunder, was my final hymn for the day that should have been my proudest. But pride, I realized, is just another kind of weight. And sometimes you have to let it die so that truth can breathe. I thought a father's place was beside his daughter. Turns out, it's wherever the truth still stands. Justice doesn't always come with noise or vengeance. Sometimes it begins the moment you walk away. I spent my life fixing old houses. I just never thought my own roof would be the first to crack. I still remember that morning in 1985, the sun rising slow over the Savannah River, light breaking across the ripples like gold shavings, and the smell of fresh-cut oak filling the air. I was 37 then. My back was straight, my hands steady, and my head full of plans. The truck bed was loaded with lumber, each board rough and heavy with promise. When the sun caught those planks, It felt like everything I'd ever dreamed was right there in the smell of sawdust and sweat. I opened my first workshop that year. It wasn't much, just an old brick warehouse on the city's edge, roof rusted through in two places, windows cracked, floor uneven. I had no investors, no employees, only these hands scarred, stubborn, and still believing that anything broken could be rebuilt as long as its foundation was true. I hung a wooden sign I carved myself, Ellison Restorations. We rebuild what time forgot. And underneath it, I etched another line with a knife tip. If the foundation's true, everything else will stand. When my wife Elaine first saw that sign, she laughed. "You talk like a philosopher," she said, holding a mug of coffee, hair tied up messily, not a carpenter. I smiled. "No," I said, "I just worry that one day our own house will tilt, and I won't know why." She walked over, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then I'll help you keep it straight," she said. We worked side by side for years after that. I handled the wood and the walls. Elaine handled the books, the drawings, the clients. There was peace in our rhythm, the sound of her pencil scratching plans, and the sound of my hammer setting beams. Once a wealthy man from Gaston Street offered me double pay to restore his 3-story mansion. I turned it down. Elaine frowned. "You serious? That's a big job." I shrugged. "I want to build something that's ours, not theirs." She just smiled. "You don't know how to rest, do you?" Maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't. In 1987, I took my measuring stick and carved a line across it. For Elaine, my forever blueprint. When I showed her, she laughed again. "If you bring that ruler to another job," she said, "they'll think you're superstitious." "Let them," I told her. "It reminds me that every strong thing I've built started with someone I believed in." Our daughter Madeline came along in 1992. That year the house was full of noise, baby cries, rain on the tin roof, and the endless hum of my sander in the back room. Elaine would sit near the doorway, rocking Maddie in her arms while I worked. Her voice would drift over the sound of wood grain being planed smooth. "She'll learn to stand steady one day," she said. "If she inherits your stubbornness, she'll be fine." I laughed. I didn't know then that she was predicting the future. When Maddie grew older, I taught her how to smell the difference between oak and walnut, how to tell the sound of a real hammer from one that was just for show. When she turned 5, I built her a small wooden chair, her initials M.E. carved across the backrest. Elaine smiled at it, but her eyes had a kind of softness, the kind that sees farther than yours. "You made her a chair," she said. "But are you sure she'll sit in it forever?" I said. "She doesn't have to. I just want her to know she had a place to sit." Time rolled forward like a steady saw blade. The workshop grew. More clients came. Local newspapers started calling me the man who keeps old Savannah standing. Whenever people praised me, I only thought of Elaine. She had this way of seeing truth in plain wood. "Old houses are easy to fix," she said once. "People aren't. They break in ways no hammer can reach." Back then I didn't understand. Now I do. Elaine was 52 when the doctors said pancreatic cancer. 3 months. That's all we had. 3 months between diagnosis and silence. She faded faster than any wood I'd ever seen rot. On her last night, I sat beside her bed, my hands rough and useless, feeling her pulse weaken beneath my fingers. "Don't fix anything else," she whispered. "Some things break so we can learn to let go." When it was over, I went home and found the measuring stick on the workbench. Dust covered the words, "For Elaine, 1987. I brushed it clean. For a moment, I thought the wood itself cracked, but it wasn't the wood. It was me. Madeline was 23 by then, fresh out of college in North Carolina. She came home, held my hand, and said she'd gotten a job in Atlanta public relations, bright city life, tall buildings. I nodded, tried to smile. Go, I told her. Don't worry about me. She looked at me, eyes wet. You'll be okay, right? Of course, I said. But the truth was, the moment she closed that door, the house turned hollow. When walls stop hearing laughter, they echo everything else. I kept working every single day. People called me stubborn. Maybe I was. But I figured if my hands could still tremble on a saw, then I wasn't done yet. I repaired houses, tiled roofs, painted walls, slept on the workshop floor when it got too late. The old fluorescent light above me buzzed softly, and the sound of my hammer was the only pulse I trusted. Some nights I'd dream that the walls were talking, saying thank you for not letting them fall. By 2020, the city had changed. Tourists were fewer. The old homes that once stood proud now leaned into neglect. I couldn't stand watching it happen, so I started teaching the neighborhood kids. That's how Jake Ramirez came in. 17 years old, thin brown skin, bright eyes, the kind of kid who'd already learned what it meant to survive. He showed up one morning standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. You really teach for free? He asked. I looked up from my workbench. I don't have time to joke, I said. Pick up that plane. Let's see if your hands shake. He smiled, nervous, but stayed. Jake wasn't fast, but he was careful. Every mistake he made, he studied. And every time he slipped, I'd tell him if the foundation's right, even a crooked wall can be fixed. He laughed. You talk like you're preaching, old man. I said, kid, there's no difference. Time kept sanding me down. By 2023, my hands had begun to tremble when I drew lines. My eyes blurred when I looked too long at the grain. But I still worked, because a man who stops building starts breaking. Orders were small, a chair here, a window frame there. But I kept the shop alive. Every creak, every smell of pine was a heartbeat. Some afternoons I'd sit by the door watching the magnolia trees sway and the river shimmer under the afternoon sun. Jake would be inside humming old country songs while sanding down a beam. I'd listen, my thumb rubbing the faded carving on my ruler for Elaine, 1987. The letters were nearly gone, but I could still read them. And I whispered, I'm still keeping it straight, Elaine. But I don't know if anyone needs this foundation anymore. That night it rained. Heavy, steady, endless. I lay on the cot in the workshop, listening to the rain hit the tin roof. Each drop sounded like a hammer tapping, slow, measured, like someone rebuilding a house inside my chest, out of memories and rot. The smell of wet wood filled the room, and I thought about every house I'd ever fixed, every crack, every nail, every layer of paint. How I'd spent a lifetime believing that if my hands were strong enough, nothing would ever fall apart. But then it hit me, some cracks don't live in the walls. They live in trust. And when trust breaks, no ruler on earth can measure it straight again. I spent 40 years keeping other people's homes standing. But the truth is, the hardest structure to keep upright is the one built on love and silence. Wood can be restored. Trust can't. And sometimes the sound of rain on a roof is the only hammer left that still knows your rhythm. I've restored more than 100 old homes across Savannah. Cracked walls, rotten floors, peeling ceilings. I've brought them all back to life. But not once have I stepped into a place colder than Monroe Hall, and yet every light inside it blazed bright. It was the last night of January. The wind off the Savannah River sliced through the trees like broken glass. I drove my old 2004 Ford Ranger silver paint flaking engine coughing down a magnolia-lined road that gleamed under frost. From a distance, Monroe Hall looked like a palace, a copper dome rising over glass walls nearly 30 feet high, white stone stairs leading up to chandeliers that burned so bright they seemed determined to outshine the moon itself. The parking lot glittered with chrome Mercedes Lexus Range Rovers, some still wearing rental stickers from long-term luxury firms. I pulled into the farthest corner where the lights didn't reach. A guard in a black suit glanced at my license plate, his face a polite mask of nothing. Trucks are for working, I told myself, not for proving who you are. But still something small and sharp twisted inside me. Not shame. Just the quiet ache of knowing this place respected polished metal, not calloused hands. On the seat beside me lay a long wooden box wrapped in brown paper and tied with hemp cord. I'd made it myself, 12 hours straight, from morning to midnight. Black walnut wood, hand-carved, oiled with linseed edges smooth as river stones. Across the lid I'd cut the words, one slow stroke at a time, M and D, built to last. Inside were 2 picture frames, one carved in an old Southern Federal motif, the other etched simply, the foundation and the future. I just wanted Maddie to remember everything lasting begins with what's underneath. The doorman greeted me with a smile, practiced in a training seminar, warm enough for a tip, cool enough to keep distance. "Mr. Ellison," he asked, "the father of the bride-to-be." I nodded. His eyes flicked down my charcoal suit, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and his smile tightened just a little before he gestured me in the kind of gesture that says, "You're here because you have to be, not because you belong." The hallway gleamed with white marble. Oil paintings of European countrysides lined both walls, not a single piece of the South among them. Above Waterford, crystal chandeliers rained down cold light. The first sound I heard wasn't music. It was glass. Hundreds of champagne flutes clinking the crisp, hollow rhythm of money congratulating itself. In the center of the hall stood Madeline, bathed in flashes from a dozen cameras. Her smile perfect, measured, practiced. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to look genuine on the Monroe family's social feed. She wore a silver-blue dress, hair pinned high, pearls catching the light like frozen raindrops. Beside her stood Daniel Monroe Jr., the only son in a tailored Italian suit, confidence pressed into every seam. The kind of man who didn't enter a room, he owned it. When she saw me, her smile faltered. "Dad." "You came," she said softly. "I wasn't sure you got the invitation." That sentence landed like someone quietly pulling a nail from a wall I'd been building for 30 years. I forced a smile. "No letter needed," I said. "A father always knows his daughter's big day." I handed her the wooden box. A small gift. "Made it myself. For both of you." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the cameras. "Thank you, Dad. I'll have them place it on the gift table." She turned to a waiter, but before she could speak, a woman's voice floated over the crowd. "Ah, this must be the gift from Mr. Ellison. Yes, Susan Monroe, Daniel's mother. 60, maybe more hair, a precise shade of expensive blonde pearls the size of thumbnails wrapped around her throat. She walked the way some women expect others to step aside. Her eyes dropped to the box, and she smiled the way rich people do at charity auctions, gracious on the surface, empty underneath. Handmade, she asked, her voice dripping polite curiosity. "Yes," I said. "Black walnut. If you keep it dry, it'll outlast steel." She laughed, swirling her wine. "Well," she said lightly, "some families build legacies, others just build houses." The words floated like perfume, but when they landed, they cracked like splitting wood. Nobody spoke. A few guests chuckled softly, the kind of laughter people use to stay near power. Maddie's cheeks flushed. She looked down. Daniel tightened his grip on her hand, a silent command. "Don't make a scene." I smiled thinly. "Maybe so, Mrs. Monroe. But at least my houses still stand after every storm." Her laugh faltered. She lifted her glass in a mock toast, then drifted away. A waiter picked up the box, but a woman from the event staff stopped him. "Excuse me," she said. "The main table is reserved for registered gifts only. Please place that one over there." She pointed toward a small side table near the coat check. A forgotten corner. I followed her gaze. That table was cluttered with paper bags, bakery boxes, and leftover menus, the junk drawer of the evening. The gift I'd spent 12 hours carving, my hands blistered and sore, was set down among disposable wrapping. And just like that, it disappeared from sight, a heartbeat lost under music. No one looked. No one asked how long it took to make. Not a single person in that $1 million ballroom cared about the one thing built with real hands. A man in a black tuxedo approached a glass of bourbon dangling from his fingers. Probably one of Daniel's friends, the kind who called themselves investors but never got dust on their shoes. He nodded toward the box. "Beautiful craftsmanship, Mr. Ellison," he said, his tone too smooth to be kind. "Shame it doesn't match the room." I looked at him, calm. "The fit of a room," I said, "depends on the people in it, not the furniture." He blinked, smiled tightly, and refilled his glass. The conversation was over before it began. I left Monroe Hall with jazz music echoing behind me, notes of brass and champagne laughter chasing me into the cold. Outside, the chandelier's glow spilled through the tall windows, staining the night gold. The wind off the river was sharp enough to taste. I opened the truck door, sat behind the wheel, and rolled down the window. From inside came the sound of clinking glass, of people congratulating themselves on being seen. A room full of voices that all said the same thing: we matter. I lit a cigarette. The smoke curled through the cab, mixing with the scent of black walnut from the duplicate box I'd made for myself. On its lid, the same words gleamed under the streetlight, "Built to last." But tonight, it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like a reminder. There are things we build to endure, and things that have to collapse so we can see what the foundation was made of. When I pulled onto the highway, the radio whispered the late-night forecast: light rain expected over Savannah tonight. I laughed quietly, voice rough from smoke. "Good," I said. "Let's see if their marble floors can handle water." The traffic lights turned red. I stopped. In the rearview mirror, Monroe Hall still blazed behind me, a crystal fortress shining for people who'd forgotten what warmth felt like. I watched until the light turned green. Then I drove. The wind poured through the open window, cold and clean. I didn't close it. They say crystal light makes everything shine, but not everything belongs under it. Some gifts were never meant for banquet tables. Some only glow in the dark, in the quiet, where hands still matter, and the work itself remembers who made it. Early March. Afternoon light spilled through the workshop windows, laying thin gold stripes across the concrete floor. The kind of light that makes sawdust look like it's floating through time. The air was thick with the scent of cut oak pine sap and linseed oil, a sharp, honest smell that only old craftsmen recognize. It's the smell of work, of memory, of solitude. I was measuring a panel of aged white oak, a commission for St. Paul's Church. That project mattered. Elaine, my late wife, and I had rebuilt the back roof of that same church in 1994. She'd just finished nursing school. I'd just opened Ellison Restorations. That summer we worked side by side. I planed wood. She primed beams. Every strike of the brush sounded like a vow we didn't know we were making. Now, decades later, whenever I touch those timbers, I can still feel her hands in the grain and realize that time is the only material I've never learned to restore. The planer hummed steady until my phone buzzed on the bench. I glanced over. Madeline. Video call. My stomach tightened. Reflex, not reason. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. The screen flared. The glare off my glasses blurred everything for a second. Then her face appeared bright, composed, distant. Not the child who once scribbled sketches on my workshop floor, but a woman who'd learned how to say cruel things in gentle tones. Behind her stretched a modern apartment, white walls, linen curtains, a vase of roses on a walnut shelf. Everything curated, everything lifeless. Beside her sat Daniel Monroe, white shirt, silver watch, flashing beneath designer light. He looked at me the way men look at contractors, not fathers. Dad Madeline began, voice thin and careful. I just wanted to talk about the wedding in April. I smiled, trying to sound casual. Good timing, I said. I'm getting the old suit adjusted. Haven't been to a party in years, might be a tight fit round the belly. She gave a small laugh. But it wasn't her laugh, not the one that used to burst out when we burned pies together. This one was trained corporate, the kind you rehearse in a conference room mirror. Dad, she said softly, there's just one small thing. I stayed half bent over the table, afraid that if I stood straight, her next sentence might break me in half. What kind of thing, I asked. Well, the seating's a bit tight. Dan's company needs to invite a few executives. We're trying to keep everything balanced. I paused. How tight exactly? She looked at Dan. He gave a polite nod, permission granted. Not much, she said quickly. But to make it smoother, we thought maybe you could just attend the ceremony. The reception afterward might be too crowded, too loud. You'd get tired. Her words fell softly, but they cut like a chisel. I set my ruler down on the bench. My fingers froze halfway through the motion. I'd get tired, I repeated, trying to smile. Madeline's face tightened. No, that's not what I meant. It's just there aren't enough seats. The Monroes want to keep it elegant, smaller. Daniel slipped in smoothly, voice polished like varnish on cheap wood. It'll be a smaller event for PR reasons. We need to control the look, you know that word. Look. People like him lived by that word. It weighed more than truth, more than blood. It decided who belonged inside the photo and who stayed behind the camera. I see, I said quietly. And the ceremony. I'll still be up front, Madeline nodded quickly, eyes darting away. Of course. You'll be in the front row. From the altar, I'll be able to see you. I smiled back, voice low, dry. You will, sweetheart. Maybe not close, but you'll see me. The call ended with a tiny click. A small sound, yet it emptied the room. I sat there for a long while, staring at the dark screen. Late light slanted through the window, falling across the workbench, and a framed photo from 2014. Elaine in the middle, her arm around Madeline, me beside them, smiling like a man who still believed work could fix anything. I reached to straighten the frame. My hand trembled. The frame slipped, hit the concrete. Crash. The sound rang out sharp, clean, final. When I bent down, the glass was cracked clean through Madeline's face. Mine and Elaine's were untouched. I picked it up. A shard nicked my fingertip. A drop of blood welled up bright against the dust. But I didn't feel pain, only cold. I set the frame on the bench, the fracture line glinting like a lightning scar. Outside, the wind came off the river, making the curtains sway like a slow breath. Sunset pooled across the table, reflecting off the broken glass light, shimmering like a knife under water. I whispered to the empty room, maybe she just doesn't want me to be embarrassed in front of them. Or maybe she's embarrassed of me. No answer, just the clock ticking. Each tick a countdown to something I couldn't name. I stood and walked to the tool wall. The measuring stick hung there. For Elaine, 1987. Darkened wood edges smooth from years of use. I laid my blood-stained palm across it. The chill went straight through my skin. Elaine, I whispered. I taught her how to build a house, but I forgot to teach her how to keep a foundation straight. Back at the bench lay the final check, $31, $200 payment to the Monroe wedding planners. My signature shone fresh and shaky but straight. I stared at it a while, then said quietly to no one, maybe everything I've ever built has just finished its part. I took a pen and drew a single line through the amount. Not hard, not angry, just enough to make it worthless. The paper tore slightly where the ink met the crease. That sound, that tiny rip, felt cleaner than forgiveness. Night came early. I didn't go home. I stayed in the shop, turned on the yellow work light, and listened as the first spring rain began tapping the tin roof. Each drop hit like a hammer stroke, slow, measured, precise. Like someone was rechecking the foundation of my life, testing how much more it could take before giving way. On the bench, the broken glass reflected the lamplight. Half showed my face, the other half empty space where hers used to be. I touched that empty spot. The blood on my finger left a dark print on the glass. I didn't wipe it away. I left it. Because sometimes a wound needs to stay open to remind you where the blade went in and who held it. Some sounds don't have to be loud to break you. A phone call. A sentence spoken softly. A single piece of glass hitting the floor. But it's those quiet sounds that cut the deepest, the ones that finally sever the fragile line between a father and the child he thought he knew. March 10th, 2025. Savannah looked dull that morning, like a slab of old wood waiting for polish. I opened the workshop early, as I always did. The air was thick with pine resin, and the hiss of wind through the cracks in the door sounds so familiar I no longer noticed them. I poured myself a mug of strong black coffee and sat at my oak work table, its surface scarred from 40 years of labor. Scattered across it were invoices, contracts, city permits, and every receipt I'd signed for my daughter's wedding. Madeline, my only child. The little girl I once carried in my arms was marrying into the Monroe family, wealthy, polished, untouchable. And I'd convinced myself that no matter how proud or condescending they were, I should be happy for her. I woke the old desktop computer. The fan whirred, the monitor glowed pale blue. First folder invoices. Monroe Wedding 2025. I was about to log the final transfer, $31,200 to the event company, when a soft ping interrupted me. New mail. Sender Carla M. PR Assistant Monroe Holdings. Subject Re-wedding Vendor Coordination. Internal only. I hesitated. Don't know why something in me refused to ignore it. I clicked. The first line hit like a nail driven clean through my chest. After the ceremony, we'll remove his name from the paperwork. It's cleaner for PR. DM. I read it once, twice, a third time. Remove his name. 3 words that turned my coffee to ashes in my throat. I scrolled down. It was a full email chain, an internal thread between Dan Monroe and his PR staff. The construction permits for the wedding venue were signed under his workshop license. After the ceremony, we'll remove his name. Use corporate branding instead. It'll look more consistent with our image. I froze, mouse still under my fingers. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, something stopped. They were talking about me, about Ellison restorations. I pulled open the filing cabinet and found the folder, the document I'd signed 2 months earlier when Dan had said, "Just temporary, Bob. The city's slow with our subsidiary's paperwork. Can you sign the permit under your name?" I had trusted him. He was marrying my daughter. I thought signing my name on a building permit was a father's way of helping the family begin. But as I looked now at that paper building permit, Monroe Hall Annex signed Robert Ellison in blue ink stamped by the city of Savannah, I finally saw the trap I'd built for myself. They needed me while they needed permission, and once they had it, they'd remove my name. I leaned back, chair creaking beneath me. My rough hand, the same hands that had rebuilt homes for 40 years, trembled slightly. Not from age, from awakening. I opened another file, my wedding expense ledger. The list glared back: deposit for venue, $42,000 florist, $7,800 music, $4,200 catering, $56,000 decorations, $9,700, total $185,000, and one line blinking at the bottom: pending transfer, $31,200. I remembered every call, every polite request. Dad, the planner, needs an extra deposit. Dad, we have to upgrade the champagne. Dan's mother prefers French only. And every time I'd answered, send me the invoice. I've got it. Because I believed being a father meant never letting your child see you come up short. But staring at that email, I realized they hadn't just erased my name from a permit. They were erasing me from her life. I turned on the printer. Its old motor whined a lonely sound in the quiet shop. One by one, the sheets came out. On top, the bold black line read, "After the ceremony, we'll remove his name from the paperwork." I laid it on the desk, then stacked every receipt and invoice I'd kept for months. The pile rose thick and heavy like a verdict written in ink. No one accused me of anything yet. I felt like I was standing trial before my own conscience. I remembered that video call last week, Maddie telling me I'd attend only the ceremony, not the reception. I'd told myself it was for my comfort, to spare me the noise. Now I saw it clearly, the first step in cropping me out of the frame. I looked around the shop at the benches, the rulers, the scraps of wood Elaine once sanded smooth. On the wall still hung the measuring stick carved with her name for Elaine. 1987. I touched it. Cold, familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend. Elaine used to say, "You trust people too easily, Bob. You trust until the rope turns into a noose." I had laughed back then. Now her words came home like a hammer to the heart. Trust doesn't snap in one strike. It rots quietly from the inside until the faintest pressure makes the whole ceiling collapse. My phone buzzed again. A banking alert. Pending transfer. $31,200 to Monroe Holdings. I looked at it. Then at the printed email beside me. The phrase "remove his name" pulsed in my head like a heartbeat gone wrong. I opened the banking app. The cursor hovered over cancel transfer. The screen asked, "Are you sure?" I whispered that I've never been surer of anything. Tap. A small click. Final. Clean. The sound a coffin lid makes when it knows it's fit. I picked up a pen and scrawled across the email's edge, "When they remove your name, they remove their roots." Then I slipped it into a folder, labeled it in firm handwriting. March 10th. Evidence. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe instinct. Maybe because a builder never throws away proof of a collapse. And this time, the structure failing was my own life. Afternoon wind rose, rattling the windows. I opened the door. Dark clouds gathered like smoke. Jake, my young apprentice, jogged up from the yard, concern in his eyes. "Mr. Bob, you okay? You look different." I smiled faintly. "Fine, kid. Just tired." He hesitated. "I heard your daughter's wedding's coming up. You must be excited." I waited, then said quietly, "Yeah. Excited." A pause. "But Jake, sometimes to build a new house, you first have to tear down the old one." He didn't understand, just nodded. And I didn't explain. That evening I left the lights off. The workshop glowed only with thin moonlight filtering through the window. On the desk, the printed email lay open. The moonbeam hit the words, "Remove his name," and the reflection formed a faint crack across the page like light trying to escape from under glass. I whispered, "Go ahead. Erase me. But don't forget who built the floor you're standing on." The room stayed silent except for the clock ticking. Each tick was steady, deliberate, like a carpenter counting the last nails of a job almost done. I don't know which cut deeper, the numbers on the invoices or the words, "Remove his name." But I do know this: people who treat justice as decoration will one day watch their own foundations crumble. Because after 40 years of fixing what others broke, I finally learned to bring down a building you only need to pull the first right nail. Savannah, March 12th. The rain was thin, almost delicate. A soft veil draped across the city. Droplets slid down the windshield of my old Ford Ranger, leaving long streaks like ink bleeding on paper. The tires hissed through shallow puddles along Whitaker Street, each splash sounding like teeth grinding in the dark. The wipers groaned in rhythm, slow and steady, each pass counting out the years I'd wasted on people who didn't know what honesty felt like. On the passenger seat lay a weathered leather folder. Inside the missent email, the invoices, the construction permit signed in my name. And at the bottom, a small note I'd scribbled past midnight. When they remove your name, they remove their roots. The paper was wrinkled, rain-stained, but the ink still held. I read it once more just to remind myself that I still believed it. When I turned down the red brick street, an old building came into view. Ivy climbing its walls, a bronze plaque dulled by time, Carter and Associates. Independent legal practice. I pulled over. The wipers stopped mid-swipe and silence settled heavy inside the cab. I inhaled deeply. The air tasted of cold metal and rain. I never thought I'd come back here. Linda Carter. We'd gone to technical school together. 30 years ago, I was just a green carpenter. She the only law student in our group of builders. In '94, when a client tried to pin a construction accident on me, Linda had saved my business. She found a single clause in the state building code no one else had even read, and turned it into a shield. I'd told her afterward, "You're not the best talker in a courtroom, Linda. You just understand the foundation of the law." Then life drifted us apart. When Elaine died, Linda sent flowers. I never replied. Not out of anger, just emptiness. Now, decades later, I was back. Not to ask for help, to finish something. The doorbell chimed as I stepped in. The smell hit me first, paper coffee, and old floorboards, the scent of a place where decisions had weight. Linda looked up from her desk. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes were still sharp, bright, exact. She blinked in surprise, then smiled. "Bob Ellison. 20 years. I thought you'd retired somewhere by the river." I removed my cap. "I thought so too," I said quietly. "Until someone taught me retirement doesn't mean being erased." The smile faded. "What happened, Bob?" Placed the folder on her desk. The sound of leather on wood was the sound of a full stop. I unclasped it, pulled out the printed email, and slid it across to her. She read slowly, turning each page with care. When her eyes reached the line, "After the ceremony, we'll remove his name from the paperwork. It's cleaner for PR." She looked up. "Oh my God," she whispered. Then she found the building permit, my signature at the bottom, the city of Savannah seal at the corner. Her tone dropped to the low register of a storm. "They used your license to legalize the construction of Monroe Hall for profit." I nodded once. The rich son-in-law needed speed. I thought I was helping my daughter get her wedding done on time. "And you signed under your workshop's license?" "Yes." "And they registered the expansion under Monroe Holdings?" I nodded again. Linda went silent. She opened a drawer, pulled out a thick volume of trade law, and flipped to a red tab. Her finger stopped at a line, section 14B. Misrepresentation of contractor license for profit. She tapped it with her pen. Her voice turned sharp as a chisel. "If they used your license for profit without naming you as a joint contractor, that's a federal offense. You could sue. If you win, they lose their business license for 3 years." Rain beat softly on the window. Her words hung heavy between us. She studied me, her brow tightening. "Bob, they exploited you. They took your name and your honor." I gave a small, tired laugh. "Come on, Linda. I'm a carpenter, not a crusader. I don't need a courtroom. I just need to see how solid their foundation really is." She frowned. "You mean to let it go?" I met her eyes. "No," I said. "I mean to stay quiet." Her voice softened but didn't lose its edge. "So what are you planning to do?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out the uncashed check, $31,200. The last payment I'd been about to send to Monroe Holdings. The paper was creased, but the ink still strong. I laid it on her desk, pushed it toward her. "Cancel this," I said, "and draft a scholarship fund for the kids training at my shop." She blinked. "You want to donate all of it?" "Yes." "What do you want to call it?" "The Ellison Apprenticeship Fund." Her gaze softened. "You want me listed as a co-signer?" I shook my head. "No. Just make it legitimate." She looked at me a long time, then whispered, "Some people get revenge with noise. You choose silence." I smiled faintly. The sound of a hammer hitting a weak floor is loud enough. She began to type. The clack of keys blended with the rhythm of rain. Occasionally she asked for a date or a signature. I answered in brief, steady words. We worked in silence, the kind that carries more truth than 100 angry speeches. When she slid the documents to me, I signed them one by one. My handwriting trembled slightly, but every line was clean, unbroken. The last signature ended with a dry scratch like a nail seating into wood. Linda watched me. "Bob, you're sure you really don't want to sue?" I met her gaze. "You know my trade, Linda. When the foundation's wrong, I don't tear down the walls. I wait for them to crack on their own. I left just before 5. The rain had stopped, but the streets still gleamed wet under the fading light. Traffic lights glowed red, reflected in the puddles like spilled blood. People hurried past, heads down, umbrellas dripping. I walked slower than all of them, because for the first time in years, I knew I was moving the right way. At the corner, a group of young men stood under a shop awning, paint-stained clothes, talking and laughing about opening their own workshop someday. One of them looked like me 30 years ago, sandwich in hand, eyes full of plans. I stood there watching, and for the first time that day felt warm. Let them take my name, I thought. Let's see how long they last without someone who knows how to lay a foundation. By the time I got back to the workshop, the light was gone. The air still smelled of rain. I placed the Ellison Apprenticeship Fund folder on the desk beside the wooden ruler carved for Elaine, 1987. The small desk lamp cast a soft amber glow, illuminating two names side by side, Elaine and Ellison. The only two I'd never let anyone erase. I poured a glass of cheap whiskey, the liquid catching the light like fire behind amber. For once, my hand didn't shake. Not because I'd forgotten the hurt, but because I'd finally shaped it into purpose. The whiskey burned down my throat, sharp, then warm. Outside, the rain started again, gentle this time. It didn't sound sad anymore. It sounded like rhythm, steady, patient, alive. That night, Savannah was raining again. Not the loud kind. Just a steady, needling drizzle, raindrops ticking on the old tin roof like pins on metal. The air thickened with damp oak, linseed oil, and smoke, a scent of things that had lived too long and endured too much. I sat in the workshop under the desk lamp's yellow pool of light. Before me lay the new folder, Ellison Apprenticeship Fund. Beside it, a half-empty glass of whiskey and the measuring stick carved for Elaine, 1987. I'd just signed the final transfer papers, every dollar gone to the fund. There were no wedding images left in my head, no white dresses, no laughter, just a flat, calm, cold as the river after a storm. Then came a knock. 3 times, slow, hard. The kind of knock from a man who's never waited for anyone. I looked up. Standing in the doorway was Dan Monroe, gray suit hair, slicked raindrops darkening the leather of his shoes. The workshop's light caught his face, casting a thin blade of shadow across his nose. "You're still working?" he asked, voice smooth, carrying that polite contempt, rich men perfect. "I didn't know there was a word for stopping," I said without looking up. He stepped inside, glancing around like a museum critic judging an artifact, the old timber walls, half-painted frames, the honest smell of pine sap. "Actually," he said, "I came to discuss business." I gave a small laugh. "Now," he nodded. "Yes, some things are better settled before the big day." I set the ruler down and motioned for him to continue. He opened a leather briefcase, pulled out a thick set of papers, and placed them carefully on the table. The top page bore the Monroe Holdings logo, Transfer of Business Identity Agreement, a full acquisition form. He was trying to buy my name. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "Why would this even exist?" Dan sat opposite me, legs crossed, that smile of his, all teeth, no warmth. "Simple, Mr. Ellison. You used your workshop's license for the Monroe Hall expansion. The city's compliance office is reviewing things. Luckily, I know people there." He tapped his finger on the table. "If you sign over the brand name, I can make it disappear. No investigation, no headlines. And of course," he leaned closer, "you'll have a place of honor at the wedding. Front row. Right beside my father." I stared at him for a long moment. Part of me wanted to laugh, but my throat was dry. Outside, the rain kept falling steady as breath. I poured another measure of whiskey, drank it slow. "Tell me something, Dan," I said. "In my line of work, when a house starts to crack, where do you think we look first?" He smirked. "At the carpenter," I shook my head. "At the foundation. You can repaint the walls, change the roof, replace the windows, but if the base is wrong, it's only a matter of time before it all comes down." He gave a light, mocking laugh. "Sounds like philosophy, Mr. Ellison. But I'm not here for a lesson in carpentry. I'm here to offer you a choice." He stood, voice dropping a tone. "If you refuse, I can make people believe you owe suppliers. Reporters love that sort of thing. Old carpenter bankrupts his own daughter's wedding. One phone call. That's all it takes. I said nothing. The rain faded. So did my heartbeat. All I heard was a faint internal crack, something giving way inside me. But instead of pain, there was clarity. I rose, walked to the filing cabinet, and took out a folder, construction permit support agreement. I placed it before him. "This what you mean?" He glanced down, smiled with confidence. "Yes. Sign the transfer line. I'll handle the rest." I picked up my pen, wrote a single word across the signature box, void. Block capitals, thick, black. The ink bled through both sheets. Then I folded the contract in half and tore it down the middle. The sound of paper ripping cut through the room like a knife through silence. I looked him dead in the eye. "You don't have the credentials to appraise my honor." He gripped his briefcase strap tighter. His face hardened. "You'll regret this." "No," I said softly. "The ones who regret are the ones who never learned what their foundation's made of." He gave a dry chuckle. "You think you can stand against a corporation? I don't need to stand against it. I just have to stand still and watch it fall." He hesitated, then shrugged like a man walking away from a minor deal. "Good luck, Mr. Ellison." His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each one like a hammer closing a coffin. When the door shut, the silence was thick enough to touch. I looked down at the torn contract. The scraps lay scattered around my boots. One by one, I gathered them, dropped them into the metal waste bin, and struck a match. The flame flared blue, then orange. The light danced on the photo of Elaine and Madeline still sitting on the shelf. Elaine's face shimmered through the firelight, as if she were nodding once the way she used to when I finally made the right call. An hour later, I drove to the Central Bank of Savannah. The rain hadn't stopped. The glass doors reflected a tired man, 67 eyes, that had long since stopped searching for forgiveness. Inside, the teller smiled politely. "How can I help you today, sir?" I slid the papers across. "I'd like to transfer the remaining funds to this account, the Ellison Apprenticeship Fund." She scanned them, brows lifted. "You'd like this processed today?" "Yes," I said. "Right now." She printed the forms. I signed the ink soaking into my fingertips. When I handed them back, she smiled again. "All done, Mr. Ellison." I shook my head lightly. "No," I said. "This isn't done. This is begun." By the time I returned to the workshop, the rain had stopped. The streets still glistened under the lamps, mirroring the gold light spilling from my door. I opened the ledger Ellison Apprenticeship Fund. Founder Robert Ellison. I smiled. For the first time in years, my hands were steady. Not because I'd forgotten the hurt, because I'd turned it into something solid. The whiskey went down warm, settling into my chest, like peace long overdue. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, rhythmic. It didn't sound mournful anymore. It sounded alive. The rich son-in-law thought he could buy honor with money and threats. But he forgot true foundations never fear the rain. Justice doesn't need a courtroom. Sometimes it's just a signature in the right place at the right time. Savannah shone that morning as if the whole city had been polished with April sunlight. The sky was so clear, each magnolia leaf reflected the light like glass. The air smelled of wet grass jasmine and a faint tang of metal from the church railings recently polished for the day's event. On Whitaker Avenue, sleek black cars rolled toward St. Paul's Church, their headlights stretching into silver ribbons on the road. The Savannah Gazette headline called it a union of legacy and power. I read that line over cold coffee and laughed. I'd built houses my entire life, but I'd never seen a legacy quite as fragile as the one they were constructing today. I arrived early. Dark suit, gray tie. Old shoes shined till the leather mirrored the light. In my hand, a plain white envelope, not a gift, but a copy of the Monroe Hall building permit and the transfer receipt for the Ellison Apprenticeship Fund. I had no real reason to bring it, but something in me wanted them to know that the only foundation I still believed in was the real one, the kind that doesn't lie. The church gleamed like a magazine cover, white pillars, red carpet, crystal chandeliers scattering sunlight across the marble floor. Jasmine petals lined the aisle, their fragrance sweet but sharp if you stood too close. Like happiness meant for display, not for touch. Guests poured in tuxedos, gowns, champagne cameras, and smiles as hollow as crystal. Words floated around like bubbles. So happy for you, they're perfect together. Phrases meant to fill air, not hearts. Inside the organ played canon in D. The same melody I once promised to play at my daughter's wedding if Elaine had lived to see it. I stood just outside, peering through the half-open door. Sunlight poured in through stained glass. For a moment, I could almost see Elaine standing in that light hair, pulled back, gentle smile, nodding the way she used to when the world still made sense. But it was only wind. The breeze carried a few jasmine petals down onto my shoulder, and the illusion broke. "Excuse me, sir." A voice to my right. A young security guard in a black vest, earpiece glinting. His face wasn't unkind, just doing his job. But I recognized the look. The same look I'd seen at Monroe Hall the day they set my handmade gift on the auxiliary table near the coats. "Only guests listed by name may enter," he said, tone firm, procedural. I smiled softly. "I'm not here to go in." He blinked, hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." I took one step up onto the marble landing. Sunlight struck the back of my neck, warm and merciless. Down the path, Dan Monroe stood in the middle of a cluster of reporters, champagne flute in hand, speaking about the partnership between two great families. His smile was smooth. His eyes were not. I'd seen those eyes before on builders who used cheap lumber and hid it under glossy paint. The kind that gleams until the first rain. When he noticed me, he froze just a heartbeat, then said something to the cameraman and walked toward me. His gray vest caught the light. His cologne hung thick and metallic in the heat. "Mr. Ellison," he said smoothly. "You made it." "I'm surprised." I looked him straight in the eye. "You didn't think I'd come?" He shrugged, smiling that perfect PR-polished smile. "I was afraid there might not be room for the past in a brand new beginning." I gave a small laugh. "The past," I said quietly. "You're standing on it, Dan." He frowned, not following. I pointed down to the white oak flooring beneath his feet. "That floor you're standing on, it's the same wood I chose, measured, cut, and fitted myself. Every inch, every nail. If the foundation's wrong, it'll crack. Not today, not tomorrow, but it will." The breeze swept between us, stirring the jasmine petals. Sunlight caught his eyes, and for once his smile slipped. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Ellison?" I shook my head. "No. I don't threaten people. I just remind them where they're standing." The organ changed key. The doors creaked open wider, and then Madeline appeared. White dress, jasmine in her hair, her face radiant in the kind of light that doesn't last. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. She glanced at me just a second, but in that second, I saw the truth. She wasn't the little girl who once ran barefoot through my workshop, laughing at the smell of fresh sawdust. She wasn't the child who used to ask Dad, "Will this house stand strong?" She was a woman now, one who'd chosen a different foundation. One built not on earth, but on reputation. I didn't hate her for it. but I felt my heart splinter like a board cut against the grain. The guard stepped forward again, voice lower, gentler now. "Sir, please step back a little. The camera crew needs a clear path." I nodded. No argument, no anger, no need. I stepped back. Then another step, until I was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Sunlight hit the envelope in my hand. The embossed words shimmered in gold. Ellison Apprenticeship Fund. The light reflected clean, not polished wealth, but truth. Inside the church, the bells began to ring. The sound rolled out across the streets, deep, resonant, unrelenting, like the heartbeat of Savannah itself. It carried me back to another morning in April, the day Elaine and I had married in this same church. She once said, "The bells of St. Paul's are the city's heart. They don't ring for joy, they ring for promise." But now the sound was different. It wasn't promise anymore. It was reminder. Every structure, even love, eventually faces its stress test. Laughter, camera shutters, voices wishing luck and fortune. All of it blurred into nothing. All I could hear was my own footsteps, measured, steady, certain, as I walked away from the church. Each step felt like a hammer striking wood, not in destruction, but in finality. By the time I reached the gate, the sun had turned fierce, the kind of light that shows every flaw. The river breeze carried a whiff of salt and oak. I turned once, just once. The church doors closed behind me slowly, heavily, their echo rolling through the courtyard. The glittering interior vanished, leaving only white stone, cold, silent, like a tomb built early for a marriage not yet begun. A small sparrow landed on the awning, tilted its head at me, then shot up into the blue. I smiled, slipped the envelope back into my pocket. As I walked down the red brick street, the sunlight hit the wet ground, scattering gold across the puddles. My shadow stretched long ahead of me, a thin black line between brightness and shade. And in that line, in the quiet between bells and wind, I knew exactly where I belonged. Some revenge doesn't need to be seen. It doesn't spill blood or raise its voice. It only needs the guilty to understand that a wrong foundation, no matter how golden, will always crack. A month after the wedding, Savannah slipped quietly into early summer rain. The winds from the river carried salt and damp through the open workshop door, stirring the string that held an old wooden ruler, the one I'd used for 40 years. The sky hung gray, a thin mist clinging to every beam and board inside the shop, like a memory that refused to dry. I was sanding an antique window frame for an old client, my hands following the grain, slow, steady, certain when the little radio on the bench crackled to life. A low voice cut through the static. Breaking news this morning, Monroe Holdings is under investigation for using invalid construction permits and substandard materials in the Monroe Hall project, the same venue where Daniel Monroe Jr. and Madeline Ellison were recently married. I stopped sanding. The paper slipped from my hand, leaving a rough scar along the wood's edge. Fine dust fell softly onto the table, mixing with the older dust of years. I shut off the planer. Silence filled the room except for the gentle tapping of rain on the roof. I sat back in my chair, elbows on my knees, and listened. The announcer's next words landed slow and heavy, each one like a hammer striking cold iron. An anonymous source has provided investigators with documents showing Monroe Holdings registered the project, using a contractor's license belonging to an individual no longer listed on the contract. The Georgia State Inspector's Office has launched a full inquiry. I knew that sound. That was the voice of justice, measured, patient, inevitable. It doesn't shout. It just taps lightly and waits for the ground to tremble. I stepped outside onto the porch. The rain had just stopped. The air still smelled of wet earth and river salt. Morning light slipped through the thinning clouds, reflected in puddles that shimmered like small mirrors. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled a deep, tired murmur beneath the city. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt something slide off my shoulders, the weight, the anger, the long endurance of silence. On the workbench behind me, my phone buzzed once. A message from Linda Carter. 4 words only. They got the files. Don't ask who sent them. I smiled, set the phone down. Didn't need to ask. Linda hadn't done it for me. She'd done it for the law and for what was right. All she'd done was set the ruler straight again. By noon, the news had spread faster than the Savannah wind. Every local paper carried the same headline. Photos of the Monroe Holdings headquarters windows, fogged yellow police tape stretched across the glass doors, red and blue lights reflecting off the rain. On the front page of the Savannah Herald was a photograph of Daniel Monroe walking out between 2 inspectors, his face pale, his tie undone. The bold headline screamed, "Scandal at Monroe Holdings, a PR empire built on false permits." I stared at that picture for a long time. He wasn't smiling. No tailored arrogance, no gleam of confidence. Just the hollow eyes of a man who never understood why the ground had given way beneath him. That afternoon, a news van pulled up outside my shop. The door creaked open, letting in the faint smell of rain. A young reporter, barely 30, stepped inside. Raincoat slung over one shoulder, microphone in hand. Polite smile fixed on his face. "Mr. Ellison, Michael Davis, Savannah Herald. We heard you once worked with Monroe Holdings. Would you like to comment on the investigation?" I looked at him, bright eyes, eager, the look of someone who'd never been betrayed by the people he built his life around. "I don't have anything to say," I told him. He hesitated. Still tried. "Sir, there are claims the construction license used for Monroe Hall was under your name. Were you aware that could be illegal?" I rested my hands on the table, glanced out the doorway, where sunlight shimmered faintly on wet pavement. "I knew," I said simply, "but knowing and doing are 2 different things." He fell silent. Then quietly, almost afraid to disturb the air, he asked, "Do you think, Mr. Ellison, that you caused this to happen?" I turned toward the camera lens. My voice stayed calm, each word heavy as oak, numb. "I didn't destroy them. I just stopped holding up a crooked foundation." Something flickered in his eyes, the kind of understanding that doesn't come from words, but from truth landing where it belongs. He nodded, closed his notebook, and left. The door shut softly behind him, leaving only the faint scent of pine resin and the slow tick of the workshop clock. That night, I sat alone. The newspaper lay beside a half-finished glass of whiskey. The headline glared in bold, "Monroe Holdings faces criminal probe." I read it again and again. Felt no triumph, no vindication, just quiet. The kind of stillness that comes when the final nail is driven in straight, and you know there's nothing left to fix. Outside, the harbor lights gleamed through the window, and a raindrop slid slowly down the glass, leaving behind a single silver trail. I leaned back, closed my eyes. In the darkness, I heard 3 faint knocks, slow, even deliberate, like a carpenter's farewell to a finished frame. No one was at the door. It was only the echo of justice coming from the foundation itself. Morning broke clear. I opened the workshop earlier than usual. The door creaked, and the scent of damp cedar poured out. On the porch sat a brown envelope. No return name. Just a note clipped to a torn piece from the Wall Street Journal, handwritten in blue ink. "Every house built on lies will one day lean. L.C." I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer beside the Ellison Apprenticeship Fund file. Then I opened the student list. The first name caught my eye, Jake Ramirez, 22, a young apprentice who'd once worked with me on the St. Paul's restoration. I remembered him asking Mr. Ellison, "Does the foundation really matter that much?" I'd smiled and said, "Son, when you understand the foundation, you'll understand people." Now his name sat on the list, and I knew one more person would learn what that meant. Later that afternoon, I drove through downtown Savannah. Crowds had gathered outside the sealed Monroe building. Police were gone now. Only the cleanup remained. The golden sign Monroe Holdings was being dismantled, letters dangling from a crane. A worker stood on the scaffolding, hammer raised. With one final swing, he struck the letter M. The sound rang through the humid air, sharp, final, metallic. It echoed off the buildings, off the wet streets, like a verdict carried by wind. I stopped, watched the letter fall. It shattered on the ground, scattering fragments of gold paint. People flinched. I didn't. I just murmured soft enough for the wind to take it. Sometimes justice doesn't need a hammer. But when it strikes, it means the foundation's already gone. That evening, I returned to the shop. Didn't turn on the overhead lights. Just the small desk lamp. The glow touched the old wooden sign I'd rehung over the workbench, Ellison Restorations. Established 1985. I didn't repaint it. The scratches stayed. The faded letters, too. Each scar was a certificate of time. Each chip of paint a signature of a life lived right. I stood there for a long while, hand resting on the engraving. For Elaine. 1987. The paint had worn thin, but the carving was still deep, still straight. The one thing in my life that never drifted off the line. Outside, the sky was clearing. The May rain dissolved into a soft river breeze. The Savannah glittered under the moonlight, its surface flat and silver, like a massive plank freshly sanded and sealed. I closed my eyes, breathed in the scent of wet magnolia and river air. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I'd won, but because I no longer had to hold up what was wrong. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped holding up a crooked foundation. And when a structure built on lies loses its support, it collapses as surely as gravity, as surely as conscience. 2 months after the scandal, Savannah had settled into summer, thick heat, damp air, and the taste of salt clinging to every breeze. Each morning began the same way, the faint buzz of cicadas hidden in magnolia trees, and the thin vapor rising off the river, like smoke from an old wound. Inside the workshop, the ceiling fan turned lazily, creaking in rhythm, the slow heartbeat of a house that had outlived its pain. On the workbench, the wooden ruler still hung in its place for Elaine, 1987. I'd grown used to seeing it every time I looked up. As long as it hung there, I still had a reason to keep working. News of Monroe Holdings had faded. Daniel's name vanished from newspapers' feeds and conversations. The same people who once toasted him now crossed the street to avoid him. Savannah had moved on onto fresher scandals, newer names. And me, I went back to my trade. Repairing frames, straightening warped boards, mending things most people would have thrown away. Every joint I glued back together was a reminder that some things can't be saved, but still deserve to be repaired. That night, I was updating the apprenticeship ledger. The desk lamp threw a golden pool of light across the paper, the blue ink smudging under the sweat of my palm. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft, hesitant, then steadier, tapping on the tin roof, like fingers marking time. Then came 3 knocks, slow, uncertain. The kind of knock from someone who isn't sure they'll be welcome. I set down my pen. The workshop fell still, only the sound of rain. When I opened the door, the humid air rushed in, and there she was. Madeline. She stood in the doorway, soaked through, White shirt clinging to her shoulders, hair tangled, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. In her arms she held a baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket, a tiny cap pulled over his head. The rain made a silver halo around her face, the same face that had once glowed under wedding lights, now hollowed by silence. She said nothing. I looked at my daughter, the one who had left under camera flashes, who once told me I didn't belong in their world. Now she trembled in the doorway, cradling a child, as if that small heartbeat was the only thing left that was real. Her voice cracked. Dad, I just need somewhere to stay. Dan's gone. I didn't ask where. Didn't ask why. I simply opened the door. Come in. It's cold out. She stepped inside. Her wet shoes left dark prints on the floor. I fetched a towel, handed it to her, then looked down at the child. A small face, high brow, tiny nose, lips pressed together in sleep. Something in that face caught my breath. What's his name? I asked. Henry, she whispered. After Mom's middle name. I nodded. Elaine would have liked that. The house went quiet again, only the hum of the fan and the scent of pine resin. I boiled water, poured 2 cups of tea, set them on the table. She sat across from me, still holding the baby tight. I'm not here for money, she said softly. I just need a place for a few days, until I find work. I studied her face for a long moment, then said, Money, no. But you can stay tonight. Her head bowed and a single tear dropped onto Henry's blanket. I said nothing, just reached for the old quilt Elaine had sewn in 87 pale green stitches, a little frayed at the edges, still faintly smelling of lavender. I handed it to her. This, I said, is warmer than money. She brushed her fingers across the fabric, eyes reddened. I miss her, she murmured. So do I said. Henry stirred, whimpered softly. I took the bottle from the counter, mixed the formula. Madeline stared, surprised. You still remember how I smiled, not looking up? Some things you never forget, like how to close a door you once opened the wrong way. She gave a tired laugh, half relief, half regret. Henry's tiny hands clutched her finger as he drank. The lamplight fell on the 3 of us, 3 breaths, 3 generations, and for the first time I understood that some ruins aren't endings. They're clearings, places for new houses to rise. Dad, she asked quietly, do you hate me? I took a sip of tea. The steam rose between us, softening the lines on my reflection in the cup. No, I said evenly. I don't hate you, but I'm not the man you can use anymore. Her shoulders shook. Tears fell silently onto the baby's blanket. I didn't reach out. There are moments when words heal and others when silence has to do the work. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and dry as old timber. You know, weak foundations aren't always because of the soil. Sometimes it's because people build too fast just to be called beautiful. I walked to the bookshelf and took down an old photograph, the 3 of us at the river, summer 2008. Elaine laughing, Madeline's arms around her shoulders, me behind them holding the ruler. I placed it between us on the table beside the 2 untouched cups of tea. That day I said your mother told you, if you ever get lost, go back to where you began. Madeline stared at the picture, her eyes blurring in the lamp's glow. I forgot, she whispered. That's all right, I said. What matters is you remembered again. Henry fell asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the fan's hum. I watched them, my daughter finally still, and her child, a piece of both past and future wrapped in blue. And I realized forgiveness isn't reopening the door. It's giving someone a place to rest without letting them back inside the past. "You can take the couch," I said. "I'll make breakfast in the morning. Henry needs sunlight." She nodded. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. I dimmed the lamp. The light left just enough glow to see Henry curled in Elaine's quilt, his hand gripping the fabric edge. Madeline slept on her side, her face calm for the first time in years. She wasn't frowning in her sleep. I stepped outside. The night was still. The river black as polished glass. Insects sang somewhere far off their rhythm, blending with the wind under the eaves. I breathed deep the smell of old rain, wet wood, and cold tea, mingling into something only the long-lived recognize: peace. Not happiness. Peace. Like the surface of sanded wood, still scarred but smooth to the touch. Forgiveness isn't opening the door to the one who hurt you. It's standing strong enough to say, "You can stay for the night, but the key stays with me." Grace, not revenge, is the final foundation worth leaving behind. 6 months after the wedding, Savannah had changed its color. The oak trees along the river had begun to yellow, and the wind carried the scent of damp wood and the briny breath of the Atlantic. On the sidewalks, fallen leaves whispered underfoot, like voices reminding the city that seasons move on whether hearts are ready or not. I was 67, living alone in a small house near the harbor, a place where the first light of morning cut through the fog and fell across a workbench dusted with sawdust. The room always smelled of pine resin, black coffee, and rust. I'd lived long enough to understand that peace isn't the absence of sound, but the moment every sound finally earns its place. My mornings were simple, so simple that anyone else might have called them dull. 1 cup of black coffee, an old jazz record, the sound of hammer against wood, dry, honest, steady as a heartbeat. Some days I didn't speak to another soul, just listened to the sparrows landing on the sill and the gentle slap of river waves against the pier. But I wasn't lonely. I'd lived in rooms full of noise and learned that silence isn't emptiness. It's the sound of someone who no longer needs to be understood. That morning the sky was clear. The sunlight came through the fog, casting a thin golden sheen over the bench. I was sanding a chair leg when I heard a faint rustle near the door. A white envelope slid through the crack, gliding softly across the floor. No postmark, no return address. Just 4 words, handwritten, tilted slightly to the right, to Dad. I froze. Didn't need to see the name. I knew that handwriting, the same script I'd taught her long ago one evening under yellow light, while her mother laughed in the kitchen. Small, slanted, careful, like every stroke had been written on held breath. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and looked out at the river. The Savannah shimmered in the morning sun, still on the surface, but alive underneath. Just like me. Only when the steam began to fade did I open the envelope. Inside was a folded letter and a magazine clipping from Southern Living. The paper carried a faint trace of perfume, one I remembered from April, the day she'd married. That day I had watched from outside the church doors. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting trembled, but the lines ran straight, as if written by someone who'd finally found her footing. Dad, I'm not asking for forgiveness. For 6 months, I've been learning how to start again from zero. I work now with a small foundation helping women rebuild their lives, especially those who once chose wrong like I did. I think of Mom often, and of you. I've learned something: love without respect is just another way to avoid loneliness. I used to think your silence was punishment. Now I know it was a lesson. I'm not asking you to take me back. I just want you to know that I finally understand what it took you a lifetime to learn. Thank you for not striking back. Maddie. I read it slowly, line by line. Some words had blurred, I couldn't tell if by water or by tears. I folded it once, then again, then unfolded it. Beneath the letter was a clipping. The headline read, "The Man Who Rebuilt Lives with Wood and Silence." The photo showed me taken from a distance, head bowed over my workbench, a hammer in hand, sunlight resting on my silver hair. Someone had taken it without me knowing. The article was about the Ellison Apprenticeship Fund, how it had helped dozens of young men and women find stable work, how a few had opened their own shops. The last line read, "When asked about his philosophy, Mr. Ellison simply said, 'A good craftsman doesn't need applause, only a solid foundation.'" I read that line again and again, not out of pride, but because I could hear Elaine's voice in it. She was still here, in the smallest things I did, in the quilt she sewed, in the ruler I carved, in the breeze that moved through the open window each morning. And now in the daughter she once held close. I stood on the porch. The river wind came up carrying the scent of salt and oak. Sunlight broke into 1,000 silver shards across the water. In the distance, a cargo ship moved through the channel, leaving a long white trail, a line drawn by a steady hand across the dark board of the sea. I opened the letter again and read her last line, "Dad. Your silence saved me from myself." No tears came, just breath, slow, heavy, then light again. A small warmth spread through my chest, like the quiet satisfaction of setting the final brick in place. I folded the letter carefully and opened the drawer of my desk. Inside was a photograph, Elaine, Maddie, and me by the river, 1995. Elaine laughing, Maddie clinging to her neck, me behind them, ruler in hand. I placed the letter beside the photo and closed the drawer. The sunlight angled through the window, catching the fine dust drifting in the air. Each speck shimmered tiny weightless pieces of memory floating, but never gone. I watched them for a long while. Didn't need words. Sometimes silence grows so full it becomes music. That evening I lit the workshop lamp. Its soft yellow glow stretched my shadow long across the floor. Jake the apprentice was still there, hunched over his first table. He looked up and grinned. "Mr. Bob, you ever plan to really retire?" I smiled. "Someday, maybe. But not today." "Why not?" he asked. "Because today someone else just started over." Jake blinked, then nodded, turning back to his work, hands steady, focused, quiet. I watched him for a moment and saw myself 40 years ago, the same hands, the same silence, but lighter now. Before closing up, I walked down to the pier. The night sky above Savannah was impossibly clear. The moon hung low, spilling silver across the calm water. From somewhere far downriver, a ship's horn sounded a deep, lingering note, woven with the hush of the tide. I thought of Maddie. Not the daughter who once turned away at the church steps, but the woman she'd become, standing somewhere in a small, bright room, teaching someone else how to balance on their own 2 feet. I whispered into the wind, "Elaine, you see her, don't you?" She finally built her foundation. Then I went back inside, poured a little whiskey, and let the amber light ripple across the glass like sunset on the river. The radio hummed softly, a local news voice reading headlines. No mention of me, no mention of her. Just one closing line that made me stop. Savannah, where those who've fallen still find a way to stand. I laughed quietly. Didn't know if it was chance or grace, but I believed it, because it sounded like the world whispering back, "I heard you." Before bed, I opened the drawer again. The letter still smelled faintly of wood and time. I slipped it into a new envelope, sealed it, and wrote in black ink, "Return accepted." Then I placed it inside the wooden box with Elaine's ruler, her wedding ring, and a piece of the old quilt. Not to send away. To keep close among the few things that still belonged to the best part of my life. She learned what it took me a lifetime to understand, that silence has its own sound. Not the sound of hate, but of a man who knows he's lived the right way. Maybe justice never comes from a courtroom. Maybe it comes from the moment the one who hurt you finally bows not to you but to themselves. Savannah, early November. The air was cool, salt drifting from the river, mixed with the dry scent of pine. Sunlight slipped through the old oaks, falling across the tin roof of Ellison Restorations. The light shimmered on the damp cement floor like the slow breath of a house just waking up. I was making coffee when I heard 3 quick knocks on the door. I knew the rhythm. Jake Ramirez stepped in his work shirt speckled with paint, and in his arms little Henry, now 6 months old. The boy wore a yellow knit cap, his round eyes wide, studying the workshop like it was a brand new world. "Morning, Mr. Ellison," Jake said, smiling. The little guy insisted on visiting. I smiled back. "You came at the right time. Today's a good day for planting." Out front beside the porch, we'd planted a young oak months ago, barely a hand tall back then. It had survived heat and storm alike. Now its leaves had darkened its roots, gripping the soil firm. Henry crouched down, tiny fingers brushing a leaf. "Grandpa," he whispered, "will this tree get big?" I chuckled. "If you care for it, right?" Jake glanced at me, his smile carrying a quiet pride. "Kind of like your apprenticeship fund," he said. 4 trainees with full-time jobs now. One just opened his own shop, called it Legacy Woodworks. I repeated the word softly. Legacy. That's a good name. Maybe I've finally built my part. We sat on the porch steps. Sunlight caught the edge of my old wooden ruler, the one engraved for Elaine, 1987. Beside it lay Maddie's letter edges, yellowed now. I no longer read it every day, but I never put it away either. Some things aren't meant to be forgotten, only to rest quietly. Henry crawled over, reaching for the ruler. That small, innocent touch made my hand tighten without meaning to. I looked out toward the river, the same Savannah that once held me in the rain, a white envelope in my hand, a church door closing in my face. Now I stood in the same city, but no longer outside any door. Jake broke the silence. "Mr. Bob, you think Maddie will ever come back?" I stayed quiet for a moment. The breeze lifted a few silver hairs off my forehead. Maybe I said slowly, "But she doesn't need to. People don't always have to return to where they started. Sometimes it's enough to know they've found their own way." Jake nodded. He didn't need me to explain. He'd once been a street kid, trusting no foundation but his own 2 hands. Now he stood here with hands that could build and a heart that could keep promises. Back inside, a piece of wood waited on the table, freshly carved with new words, "Ellison Apprenticeship Fund, since 2025. I planned to hang it at the gate, not as a monument, but as a reminder every structure, whether made of timber or of people, needs a steady base. Jake set Henry on the table. The baby looked up at me and laughed, a clean, river-bright sound that dissolved everything heavy in the room. The afternoon sun slanted lower, catching the river in molten gold. Our shadows stretched across the wooden floor, an old man, a young man, and a child. 3 generations, 3 different times of life, bound by one thing, hands that don't give up. I poured tea, 3 cups, 2 big, 1 small. Henry reached out, tapping my cup so that a few drops spilled. I laughed. "That's all right. Every foundation starts a little wet." Jake hesitated, then asked Mr. Bob, "Do you ever regret anything?" I looked out the open door, where the scent of resin met the salt of the sea. "No." Regret's what you feel when you know what's right, but stay silent anyway. I was silent, but I chose when. A soft gust swept through the room. The ruler on the bench quivered in the light. I laid my palm on it. The wood was cool under my hand. "Elaine," I whispered. "You understand now. I never took revenge. I just restored the balance." The wind stirred again. I heard what might have been a quiet laugh, or maybe just the trees, but I believed she was listening. Henry crawled toward the oak sapling, touching its leaves once more. The sunlight flickered through the branches, casting dappled gold across his face. I watched, feeling a peace so deep, it needed no name. I once stood outside a door, I thought. Now I just want a window that opens to calm. I'd built homes for others all my life. Now all I wanted was to build one roof for those who know how to hold steady. Savannah hushed around me, just waves and distant saws. The sky turned amber. No rain, no shouting, no envelopes. Only wind and silence that no longer hurt. I said softly, almost to myself, "Maybe I've finished my part. If it were you, and the door that once shut in your face stood open again, would you walk back inside or keep your peace outside?" Leave your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories where justice and mercy meet in silence.